Good morning. Got a great crowd. Thanks for being here. It's the 28th IT Expo. We really appreciate you all being here. I am extremely excited about this next keynote. I'll tell you, in my career, it's probably the most honored that I've been to introduce someone and bring them on stage and to share them with you and help educate you. But before we get started, I just want to let you know a couple things because I've had a bunch of questions about this. Our next keynoter will not be available after the presentation, but he will be in the exhibit hall where you can meet with him today. So I suggest you all go to the exhibit hall and spend as much time as you can in the hall today, and hopefully you will be able to spend some time with him and maybe exchange business cards, talk with him for a little bit. I also not only want to thank the sponsors and all of you for being here, but also ANPI, who helped sponsor the WAS keynote. And I want to remind you all to stop by the ANPI booth in the hall and pick up a pair of sunglasses. The hall is going to be open from 11 to 5 today, and at 4:45, I will be giving away a Jeep to somebody. Brand new Jeep, black Jeep in the back of the hall. So I hope one of you wins it. You just have to fill out a little card, get it stamped, and hand it in, and you're going to have a shot at winning the Jeep. So I had a very long bio that I was going to read on our next keynoter, but I think the best way to introduce him is, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage a man who needs no further introduction, the WAS.
Hi, slight audio problem they had to fix. Technology problem, it was the audio, you know. Everything these days has a computer in it. Everything fails, and I just tell my wife, everything's got a computer in it. They will fail. I'll turn it off, turn it on. They should kill the people who made these computers. And, yes. So great to be here in Las Vegas and having a great time here. I'm glad that the conference is here this year. You know, I was inspired my whole life by electronics and engineering. And many of you in this room can go back to when you were a young child growing up and your first exciting experiences with switches and lights and deciding you wanted to be a part of this. This was some way that somehow it was interesting to you in your life. And a lot of the kids in school are just doing all the normal subjects that you're taught, are the things that you learn in life. So electronics is often something you do alone at first and on your own. It's not like you have a lot of courses in school, but you read books, you have heroes in the science fiction world, you've got stories about kids that run their own companies and solve the world problems in a laboratory, and you hear about these famous scientists. And the funny thing is, if you're good at math and you're good at science and these things, you always value what you are good at. So if you just happen to luck out and beat the girls on flashcard in third grade, you start thinking, I'm a mathematician. I'm going to do things that have to do with math. And that's a good, head towards engineering. My father was an engineer, and I was going to be an engineer when I grew up. And I told him that. And I was going to be a school teacher second of fifth graders. That's just where my values fell. The teachers were important to guide us into being able to have good jobs and make an income and own a house and have a family and all those great things in life. So it was, it's engineers. Basically, their role is to create great appliances that make our life at home easier. I thought that when I was young. I still think it to this day, that that's the main role. But all the great things in the world, buildings and bridges and all that, are really created by people that design them. And they have to use mathematical techniques to know the right materials and how to build them, and also how to improve those materials is often done down at the science level. When young, I had a lot of science fair projects that when I look back, they were immense. They were huge for a young kid to build. Numbers of parts, physical size, amount of hours, drilling holes, 100 holes for lights and hundreds of switches and that sort of stuff. Big projects. I didn't realize it at the time. It was fun. It was understandable if you learn one simple little concept. A switch, a logic gate, a transistor. Then you can apply that method 100 times and get something very big and valuable out of it, but it seems kind of like a small thing once you've learned it once. I was definitely a prodigy. I was winning awards for electronics projects in 8th grade, beating out the 12th graders in science fairs. I discovered logic by accident. Logic was a part of the world. It was digital. I had been an analog engineer. I was a young kid, 6th grade, I had my ham radio license. But I discovered this digital world. There were no books. There were no ways to run into them. Accidental discovery. If I hadn't found one journal in our hallway, I wouldn't be here before you to this day. And it talked about logic, little devices. Logic makes decisions like a switch on the wall to turn a light on. It makes decisions like playing games, like adding and subtracting numbers. And then eventually, I learned transistors, how electrons flowed in transistors to make logic out of real physical wires and things. Really did stuff. This was interesting. To have a life as a kid, to have a hobby where you can actually build devices that do things, that just turn on lights or add numbers or play the game of tic-tac-toe. So one of my huge projects in 6th grade was to build with hundreds of transistors and diodes and resistors, 100 logic gates that could play every single move in tic-tac-toe and never lose. And I remember as a young kid sitting on paper for 2 days playing every single game of tic-tac-toe you could possibly play, numbering the squares 1 to 9, and then coming up with my design. So very hard work on large projects was unusual in those days. Normally, all you got was the normal school projects for most kids. I didn't get recognized by others. Nobody else did this electronics thing in my school. We had a few electronics kids on my block, a few electronics kids who had engineers as parents, and that leads us into it. So heck, we'd come up with our own ideas. We'd run wires down the fences and set up house-to-house intercoms. We didn't copy anybody's circuit. We just bought some parts that we thought would work, put them together with some batteries, and sure enough, we had carbon microphones and little speakers, and we could wake each other up at 2 in the morning and sneak out our windows and go toilet paper houses. Electronics was a lot of fun because we did these unusual things on our own. When you do something on your own, it's personal. It's you. It's your life. It's not like you're building a project you read about in a book. By high school, I was so good in electronics, my electronics teacher sent me down to program a computer. And one of the first programs I ran, it was a chess problem, didn't get an answer. And then I figured out it was going to take 10 to the 25th years to solve this little chess problem called the Knight's Tour. And I know that human beings have figured out how to solve it. What that taught me is a computer that can do 1 million things a second, 1 billion things, 1 trillion, it doesn't matter how fast the computer is. The methods to solve the problems of the world are what make them solvable, and that only comes out of a human mind. The human brain has the intuition to figure out how to solve a problem. Computers aren't there yet, and I believed all my life they'll never get there, but I have changed my mind in the last few years. I'll get to that near the end. So I discovered a manual describing a computer in high school, and we didn't have them in our schools. We didn't have computers in schools. I discovered the manual down at a company where I was allowed to program. And I thought, my gosh, back to elementary school, all my logic gates that made decisions, could I figure out how to combine on paper a bunch of logic gates to make this computer I read about? It was the PDP-8 from Digital Equipment. And it took me quite a few months to finally get to where, yes, I could actually design a computer. I was sure of it. And not very good. And then I started getting every little manual of all the mini computers of the late 1960s. And every single computer, I would sit down for a weekend. 2 days, I'd close my door. 2 days, I'd use the newest chips manuals that had 2 bits on a chip instead of 1 bit, or 4 bits instead of 2, the newest chips, and I would design the computers over and over and over, and I challenged myself, can I do it? Design it with fewer parts. I could never afford to buy a single chip, but I could take the time to design. I loved it. It was a hobby. It wasn't anything I'd ever thought I'd do as a job. When I was an engineer later in life, I was going to be doing things engineers do, televisions and radios. I mean, computers, the only thing I knew about computers were they were in places like called research or something, you know, some strange place. It didn't make sense to me as a student. But I got so good, got to where I could design any computer in the world in 2 days, And I had a repertoire of tricks to save parts because I kept challenging myself. I was competing with myself and not with other people. If I'd been given a grade for designing a computer, I would have moved on, done something different. I'm done. I finished this course. I would have thought I'm done. If I had gotten paid a salary for doing it, I'd just move on to the next project. But this was something I did for about 2 years straight, designing over and over. And the tricks I came up with, I'm holding ones and zeros in my head, and what if I pretend that this is a 1 and a 0? And I've got free gates, and if I combine a NAND gate and an exclusive OR gate, my gosh, they were free, and I had them available on some of the chips. But I wouldn't have had an inverter and an exclusive OR instead. So I did everything I could to save parts. And people would look over and say, wait a minute, why are you using a register that stores a 1 and a 0? And I said, no. I have it wired in a tricky way that it inverts a 0 to a 1 and a 1 to a 0. All these tricks of using parts in ways they weren't intended, but it was to I don't know, have the fewest number of parts in my designs that was possible. And I knew that I was really good. But I didn't think I'd ever do it as a job. Went off to college and Introduction to Computers, graduate level course. I took it because I was in engineering. I got an A+, and I ran every program I could think of. I ran our class 5 times over budget. See, I didn't know they had a budget. I didn't know about money. And supercomputer in 1968 cost a lot of money. And oh my gosh, they were talking like I might have to pay myself more than out-of-state tuition to go back the next year to that wonderful college in the Rocky Mountains in the snow, and I was scared. But while I was there, I did something fun with electronics. Went down to Radio Shack, bought their highest speed transistor of the day, wound a little coil myself, and built a little transmitting device, a radio transmitter. I mean, I'd built receivers and transmitters, kits for my ham radio life anyway. And I went to the one color TV on campus. It was in a dorm, a girls' dorm down in a basement, and everybody would go there and watch it. And I turned on the jammer, and it fuzzed up the picture. So a friend of mine in the front row, with no planning, waxed the TV, and I made it go good. And then I got this funny idea. We hadn't planned this. I got a funny idea. I'll jam it, and every time he hits it, I'll make it go good. So he'd hit it and it'd go good. And I made him hit it harder and harder and more times. And then for 2 weeks, they sat somebody next to that television every night. And it was their job to whack it. You'll do anything to an inanimate object. You wouldn't hit a person. You might be the most peaceful person in the world, but boy, when an inanimate object doesn't work, you'll slap it to the ground or whatever. So I started playing with their bodies. They'd go up to the fine-tuning control, and tune it a bit, and it'd go good. They pull their hand away, and it goes bad. So I started playing with their bodies like you were training rats to run a maze. And I should have gotten a psychology degree. Never once did they suspect somebody in the room was playing with them. And so they one time they said, okay, the TV's good. And one guy had his hand on the middle of the screen. He was standing up with a foot on a chair. And I made it go good. So then they kind of said, okay, it's good, relax. And everybody pulls away, and it goes bad. They said, find out where your bodies were. Eventually, the guy touches the screen again, and it goes good. Pulls his hand away, it's bad. He puts his foot down on the floor, and it goes bad. He puts his foot up in the air, and it goes good. And he turned to the audience, and he said, it's a grounding effect. I had so much fun and joy with that, never getting caught. I was telling that story once in Cincinnati, and my microphone, of course, at the podium failed. It was a smaller room than this. So I started talking without the microphone, and then the microphone worked. I went back to the microphone, and then it turned out that the audio crew was playing with me. So it comes around, goes around. Let's see, what did they say about Vegas? Stays in Vegas. My next year was at a different college, and a friend had duplicated the key to the computer room. They didn't know it. But a computer sitting there, an IBM 360, all night long, unused by anyone, that was a crime. That was a crime. And I was going to rectify this crime and be Mr. Policeman. So I went in and made sure that computer got used late at night, midnight on. And then I took a year off to earn money for my third year of college, and I worked programming a computer. An executive said he could get me chips to build one of my computer designs. And I went home that night, and I designed a very simple machine that was a computer. And a friend and I were building it, drinking cream soda, and we called it the cream soda computer. And he introduced me to Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs was very young, 16, and he was like a normal 16-year-old, a little bit on the hyper ADHD side of things. He didn't get that great of grades in school, but he did interesting things, you know, like making claymation movies with his friends and exploring tunnels under the school. And we talked about the pranks we'd done. We talked about life and how important it was. Well, Steve had never, he had heard of Bob Dylan, and he could always quote a line, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, because he liked to live free and with no money kind of thing. And he was still in high school. So I showed him all the liner notes to all the Dylan albums that I collected, you know, and I really brought him into that world. We discussed how Dylan spoke real thoughts, existential thoughts, thoughts about the world and life and where we're going. And that was much more important than the pop music of the Beatles. So when you see me represented as being for the Beatles in the Jobs movie, please, please, I'm so embarrassed. It's the yeah, Jobs is Dylan and I'm Beatles. Steve Jobs worked at Haltech for a while. Haltech Electronics sold surplus electronic parts. And he got to know, you know, how you could find sales of things, buy things surplus from companies very cheap. I saw him once in his room take a phone call, and he arranged to buy 100 switches for 6 cents each, and then he hung up and told me he knew he could sell them for $6 each. And I thought, oh my God, that's shameful. I mean, if you sell something for twice as much, it's a high profit, or 5 times as much, selling it for 100 times as much. And he said, well, they don't know what it you know, sells for, what it costs. They don't have to know. So he was a real good salesman and negotiator. That was, you know, one of his keys to making money throughout his young career, having a little, you know, money like we all get allowances. Eventually I made a device for making free phone calls called a Blue Box. My 3rd year of college at Berkeley, and people were interested. I was a shy person. I'd sit in back classes, hardly ever talk. I didn't have any normal friends, didn't have a social life. I didn't know how to speak small talk. And here I was in college, but I was coming up with the ideas for the pranks. I was telling everybody about these devices, blue boxes, black boxes, red boxes, tricks with green wires on payphones. And I was sort of like the center of attraction. I was the master of ceremonies. And Steve Jobs said, hey, we could sell this to one of the students. We could sell it for 150 bucks. It cost me 75 to make it. Chips were so expensive, single quantities back then. Okay, so we would give demonstrations and we'd sell blue boxes to students that year. And that was another thing, and we would split the money. Steve Jobs would just always had a knack for being able to know what you had that had value and you could sell it. Steve went off to Reed College. I drove him up there myself, and he got a list of classes he was supposed to take. And he thought when you went to college, you took whatever you felt like. You dropped in on any courses you wanted to. He didn't realize they still assign you courses just like high school, and he didn't like that, so he didn't attend any of them. And I was kind of shocked. I wouldn't be that brave. But, you know, he was more independent, going his own way than most people. So while he's up in college, I get a job on the hottest product in the world at the time. It's the iPhone 5 of its day. The HP 35 calculator had come out. Scientific handheld calculator in your hand, cost $400. That's a couple $1,000s today. And yet, within about 2 to 5 years, every slide rule, every $10 slide rule was out of business, because every scientist, every engineer had to have this machine that you didn't have to guess little, you know, accuracies in numbers. You just punch in the digits and it's there in the display. It calculates instantly and accurately. Everyone had to have this device. Well, I didn't have a college degree, but they heard I was some kind of great computer designer. They brought me in, interviewed me, and hired me on the spot. I got to work for the company that I loved so much because they made precision equipment for engineers. And I loved engineers. I believed engineers were the best people in the world because what they make has to work. You are judged on engineering. You can't just sort of have nice little words and talk and, you know, talk the teacher into giving your report a B+ instead of a B. You actually have to have the right answers and make things work in engineering. So I'm working for a company that made the tools that engineers used. It was a different company back in those days. And I'm designing different HP projects during the daytime. But since I was so geeky and had no chance of having a girlfriend or a wife, I'd come home from work, I'd watch Star Trek, I'd have a TV dinner, and then I'd get to work on my own electronics projects. That was my hobby, thinking up ideas, something new I could build. And you know, I actually got a reputation around California for designing things for people for free. Just if they had an idea, I'd come in, do the design for them, design the first hotel movie system, design some SMPTE timecode readers for videotape that could, you know, go about 100 to 1 in speed range. They could read the code, the time codes on, and I saw Pong in a bowling alley. And that was one of those things that, like an Apple product today, my jaw dropped. I never expected to see anything so incredible as a pinball machine, but it was electronic. It had used a television screen. And I sat there wanting it, and it forced my brain to think, wait a minute, I have a television at home. I know everything about television electronic signals, the analog stuff. I can build a device digitally with few affordable chips that puts all the right signals to my television set for balls and paddles and makes decisions about playing the game. And I built my Pong with 28 little $1 chips. And then I added 2 chips that would, 2 little prom chips so that when you missed the ball, it would say a 4-letter word like heck or darn on the screen. And next, Steve Jobs came back from Oregon. He came back from college briefly, and he saw the Pong game. And he took my board down to Atari, the company that was bringing arcade games to the world for the first time, the company that was bringing television-based arcade games to the world. It was in Los Gatos, California, where I live now. Los Gatos, famous for Atari and the invention of the arcade industry, except we're more famous for the guy who invented the pet rock. Gary Dahl is his name. So Steve Jobs went down to Atari, and they hired him. I don't know if they thought he had designed the board or what. He was never an engineer that could design things, but he knew electronics, and he could maintain them, fix them, test them, add little parts to them. So he was on his way towards being an engineer, but never did engineering. Didn't quite get to that level. He never did programming, but he had this job at Atari, and he'd bring me in at night. This is cool. The hottest thing in the world was arcade games at that point in time, besides our Hewlett-Packard calculators. And I got to go in at night and see the factory floor and try the new games out and get good at them. And I felt so privileged. And then Steve said to me one day, he said, they need a 1-player Pong game. Could I design it? And I said, yeah. And then he said, 4 days. You have to do it in 4 days. This is the day of hardware games, no software, no computers. They didn't even use color TVs. All the games were black and white. And I said, 4 days and nights, oh my God, I need months. I don't think I can do it, but I'll try. I'll try. This was so exciting, a chance to build a game that other people would pay money to play, little children would pay money to pay, meant a lot to me, because I always thought a lot about kids and education. And I went in and worked 4 days and nights, not sleeping. Steve Jobs would wire wrap the prototypes. I would test them. We'd make changes. He'd rewire wrap it. And we got it done and delivered it to Atari. We didn't sleep for 4 days and nights. We both got the sleeping sickness, mononucleosis. So it was quite a memorable time. My head was floating, and into my head, I thought, wouldn't it be neat to have color in a game? And then I went back and I thought of how color is represented in American analog televisions. A wave that goes up and down at exactly the right speed, exactly the right rate, that is color. And then I thought, wait a minute, what if I took a little, normally it costs $1,000 for a color generator board with all these op amps and differential calculus to solve all the circuit equations and make things work well for your color TV? And I thought, what if I had a little $1 chip, ones and zeros, 4 ones and zeros, and I just circled it around, 1100, 1100. It's a signal, it goes up and down and up and down. If I circle it at the right speed, I knew every color television made would think it's color, even though it didn't obey any rules of color that had ever been in a book or in any theory or any class. And that was a very useful idea, as it turned out, an important idea for the start of Apple and our 6-color logo. Well, we got that project done, and next I saw somebody typing on a big teletype to a computer across the country. The ARPANET existed, the forerunner of today's internet, the inspiration for today's internet. And it was 8 colleges, only 8 at that time, all connected with a wire. And when you logged on, I would phone over a modem, a number in Stanford, phone it from a terminal. And it was a slightly pay call from where I lived. Across the street was Stanford's area code, and my side was San Jose's area code. So I called this number at Stanford, and I was on the ARPANET, and it listed 8 campuses, and I could push 4, and now I'm on MIT's computer, and I could push 2 to log in as a guest. And then I could see all sorts of files and play games and stuff. This was incredible, so I had to build my own. I had a television. I'd already used my home television as the output for Pong. I just used it and put characters on it, and now it was the output for a computer, talking to me in text. And wow, I could play computer games and that kind of stuff right from my own home. Had to pay $60 for a keyboard. The cheapest keyboard I could find in any of the electronics magazines at work, and $60, today, that's hundreds of dollars that keyboard cost. Most expensive part in the computer by far once I got to a computer. So I am able to, with my terminal, call a faraway computer in Boston, type to it, and it could type back to my TV. This was cool. A club started up called the Homebrew Computer Club. And I was told it was for people that had video terminals and things. And I thought, wow, I will be a star. You know, normally I don't talk much, but I do talk when I'm a star. And I'll go down and I'll pass out my designs and tell people, you can build your own terminal. It's very affordable. I had done research, and even the memory chips that hold the content of the screen, I had chosen the absolute lowest cost chips, some little dynamic PMOS registers in 8-pin packages, tiny packages, chosen the lowest cost ones possible to make this terminal. So I went to the club and I found out it was really about, it was going to later be called the Homebrew Computer Club. It was about people interested in these computer kits, which were really glorified microprocessors. You take the Intel datasheet, put in their parts on a board, PC board, put in a bunch of switches and lights, and you call it a computer. And really, it can't do anything. It was about the same as my cream soda computer from 5 years before in its abilities. I was so far beyond that. And I thought, you don't want to flip switches for ones and zeros. You don't want a front panel. It's ugly mechanical stuff. You just want to use it like a Hewlett-Packard calculator. You type on a keyboard like a human, and it understands you. And that's what I wanted. And I thought, I've got a keyboard terminal already that talks to faraway computers. If I put a microprocessor and enough memory on this board, I can make it a useful computer. How much is enough memory? I had decided that long ago. In high school, I told my dad I was going to someday own a 4K Nova mini computer. Nova, because the architecture was so beautiful, it was based around chips that were available, and it took half as many chips in my design. Why 4K? 4K was enough to run a computer programming language. I could sit down and solve problems like my Knights Tour chess program and things like that. I could type in real-world programs. I could type in the stuff that I did at Hewlett-Packard on their computer, shared by 40 engineers. We all signed up for turns on it. I could just type it in and do all my circuit simulations on my own machine. I wanted it so bad. 4K of memory was so expensive back then, you couldn't make a personal computer with a decent price. Except the 4K dynamic memories came out that summer and made it possible. 3 companies introduced them. I bought some at the club. Later on, moved up to Intel ones because Steve Jobs said, why didn't you use the Intel ones? And I said, I could never afford anything with Intel's pricing. And he said, what if I can get you some for free? See, Steve had the social gnats of dealing in the computer parts world, so he got a rep to give us 16 chips for free. Turned out to be the right of the 3 chips to use. It was beautiful, it was smaller, it was TTL compatible, which saved a lot of hassle and didn't need high voltage clocking. It was really a beautiful chip, but it led to the next generation, not only of 4K chips, 16K chips, up to 64K chips, 256K, and so on to this very day. So very lucky help there. Anyway, and that was later on. But before this happened, before Steve Jobs knew about the computer, I built it and I had it working. My own computer, I could type stuff in, see it on the screen. And I was working on my BASIC and got up to where I could print the numbers, you know, from 1 to 10 continuously or whatever I wanted to do. And this was so neat. I'd go to the Homebrew Computer Club. We would have about 2 hours of meeting called the mapping period where people would offer suggestions. They would talk about the future. Stanford professors spoke to us about what computers were going to mean to society and the world, how education was no longer going to have to wait 24 hours to find out if your answer was right or wrong. You'd get instant feedback, which was the important thing. And we'd communicate with hundreds of people instantly, and hundreds of people over an hour. And I thought that was so incredible an idea. And the little guy who was unnoticed, nothing in the world, the technical nerd at work, all of a sudden, with his own computer, would be a hero, typing in the company's financial data and popping out the results better than their big computers and high-paid programmers could. Oh my gosh, I was stimulated by these ideas of a social revolution. And a social revolution needed a digital revolution first. It needed the computer revolution. So I designed the computer that was affordable, good, and complete, you know, and usable. Oh, I passed out my design for free to everybody. No copyrights, no nothing. I said, here, you could build your own. Look at it. All it is about 30 little $1 chips and a microprocessor and some memory, and you can get that yourself. Nobody had the gumption in the club to build one. They weren't builders. They were people that loved talking about ideas about things. They didn't really build them. So I helped one guy build a computer. So there was at least one other Apple I working. Steve Jobs came back from Oregon, and he came to a computer club meeting where I would lug in my TV set, and after the mapping period was over, we had a random access period where we'd sit down, and I would always set up my TV and my keyboard and type away, and I had a huge crowd, actually, that had started to gather around me. First of all, looking over my shoulder, they saw the formula for personal computer that was affordable. They didn't see how good it was going to be by the Apple II. This was the Apple I. But they saw the formula, and Steve Jobs came by, and he saw the interest. And remember, he's a parts salesman. He said, let's start a company. Not to build a computer, not to change the world. I was telling him all the ideas about how these were going to affect the world in specific ways. He just wanted to build a PC board so people could build their own easier. We'd build the boards for $20, sell them for $40. And we'd have a company. Company's a scary thing when you don't know if you're going to make a profit. And he said, what the heck? We're best friends. We do all these projects together. This was the 5th time I'd developed something for fun that Steve found a way to sell it. He'd even sold my terminal. And I said, well, yeah, who could turn that down? You're young. You want to have a company with your best friend. So we went into business. First of all, I worked for Hewlett-Packard, and I would never do anything behind their back. I would never start a company behind their back. I told them what they could build for how much. A personal computer, you type on a keyboard, you use your home TV for a display, input, output's expensive, and they turned me down for the first of 5 times. Then Paul Terrell at the local store, the Bite Shop, told Steve, what people want when they come in is not kits. They don't want ways to build their own computer. They want a completely built computer. Our computer was so small on one board, didn't have front panels or any of that stuff. My gosh, we could get our whole board completely assembled at the company that made the PC boards, completely assembled with all the parts in it for $13. Who the heck wouldn't pay $13 to save you all the dozens of hours of wiring things together yourself? So Paul Terrell said, we want completely built computers, and Steve Jobs got him, you know, Steve was a good negotiator, you know, when it came to selling something. Got him to buy 100 computers for $500 each. That's $50,000 in a day when my salary as an engineer was $25,000. Twice my salary, scary stuff. Went to Hewlett-Packard's legal department and circulated it to every Hewlett-Packard division, my description, and nobody in Hewlett-Packard wanted to do this machine. Got turned down for the second of 5 times at Hewlett-Packard. And Steve and I were really in business. Okay, now we needed a place to build them. Our first PC boards got built, and we had to stuff the chips in Steve's kitchen. And after a while, for about the first 25 boards, we paid his sister $1 a board to plug the chips into the sockets. Then we set up a bench in the garage. On the bench in the garage, I'd put on each of the 25 computers, test it, and if it worked with a keyboard, a power supply, and a video display, put it in a white box. The next one didn't work. I'd find the problem with an oscilloscope, I'd fix it, put it in a white box. Next one might work. About half of them worked and half need a little fixing. Sometimes traces had shorted on the PC boards. Sometimes plug in a chip into the socket, a pin of the chip bent under and didn't go in. So we got good at fixing them. Once we had 25 boxes with computers in them, Steve drove down to the store and got paid cash. Now, we were in our young 20s. We had no money, no savings account, no friends with money. So how do you build $50,000 worth of computers when you have no money at all? Zero. Well, we got all the parts on credit. The PC boards we had already invested by selling I sold my Hewlett-Packard calculator, Steve sold a van. That's how we got the money to make the PC boards, but all the parts we got on 30 days credit. We built up the computers real fast in 10 days, drove them to the store, and they paid us cash on delivery. And then Steve did the business on his phone. He did the business to get parts supplied to us, did the business to find the computer stores were starting up. One little computer store per city. They didn't look professional like today. They were little mom and pop things, and they'd have a few computers on the shelf space, a couple of brands, and we got popular pretty quick in that field. Steve would also call magazines and get publicity, and sometimes I'd have to write things because I was the only one who really knew the specs of our stuff. And in those days it was still kind of geeky. It wasn't like computers for normal people yet. And we built up a bank account, working out of the garage that way. Well, how much work did we do in the garage? It took about 3 hours to debug and package up those first 25 computers. And we only built 150 computers total. So you could add it up. It wasn't very many hours that we spent in the garage. The boards were manufactured somewhere else. All the design took place in my cubicle at HP and my messy apartment with wires across the floor. And all the business got done by Steve on a phone in his bedroom. Although eventually I think he got a long extension cord and he could actually sit in the garage and answer. What was the garage if it was hardly ever used? Well, when people wanted to come and visit us, to talk to us that maybe they were in town and they had a store in Philadelphia that was selling our computer or wanted to sell it, they'd come to the garage and the door was open and they'd just walk in. And if somebody important, like the Apple II was actually designed before we shipped an Apple I. And this Apple II was going to change the world, and we knew it. We weren't giving it away. But if they wanted to come and see the Apple II, I would do a demo for them and explain what was on it, because I was the only one who could do that. And they'd come into the garage for that. So the garage was our front. It was our appearance to the world. But really, it was a short time, just a few months, that we were kind of doing anything in that garage at all. And they used the story, we started in a garage. Not the same as Hewlett-Packard. We didn't really have a company in the garage, but it was just our presence. Shortly after, okay, so the Apple I is selling. We're getting a name. We built up enough money. Steve went around looking and found a little local office. We walk into this little office, about 3,500 square feet. We could rent half of it for a certain number of months, and then we would take the other half. And wow, and it was just blank, and went down there. Cool, we're going to have our own office. The Apple II was so big, we knew it. We shivered. We saw that you could write little programs, even in BASIC, and make colored dots on the screen move 1 million a second. You could have animations. You could have games, real stuff on this Apple II. Half as many parts, half the cost of an Apple I. Some of the most incredible design techniques of my life. And it had paddles for games, and it had color commands in the BASIC language. So we knew this was going to be big, and we weren't giving it away. Went looking for money and eventually stumbled onto an angel named Mike Markkula. And Mike came in. He had business experience. He was a financial guy. He was investing his money. He was looking for things to do in electronics. And he got turned on. The way Steve was always talking with such spirit and such promoting the future, Mike Markkula started becoming a believer that this market was going to grow huge. It was one of those rare times where you start a company with nothing, and within a few years, you're like $1 billion company. It was going to be a very rare time in life if the home computer market happens. Our vision was a home computer, a computer keeping track of the things you do in a home, storing your recipes and handling your checkbook reconciliation. And it was really far off the mark of how people think of computers, the most important thing of computers today. We didn't envision the internet. We didn't envision, a lot of the social networks and mobile and all that stuff. But we could have our own computer. So he invested the money. And he told us what our roles would be. And he told us what kinds of people you had to hire to have a company. And he told us what their responsibilities would be and how to hire them and how to keep professionalism in the company and the importance of professionalism. So he was really the leader. He was the teacher. He was not Steve Jobs' stooge, as they show in the movie, with Steve Jobs directing him how to do things. Mike was very sophisticated. He was very honest. He was very open. But he was businesslike. And he said, you know what? We got to be a marketing-driven company. That's what makes companies like IBM successful. Hewlett-Packard was an engineering-driven company. How could they have been successful in those days? Well, they made tools for engineers. So every engineer designing things at Hewlett-Packard was the market. They were the ones that knew the value of the products they were building. So yes, we engineers could come up with the ideas for products. Didn't have to come from marketing down to us. It could flow in both directions in that company. But Apple was going to be a marketing-driven company, and Mike Markkula, our investor, would run marketing, which had been his job at Intel before he retired on a good stock option. Well, he was an admirable person, and we hired a president. And Steve had a friend at Atari, an analog engineer that could design a special power supply that used less energy and ran cooler, and we wouldn't have to have a fan inside the first computer in the world to ever have a plastic case. So we hired Rod Holt for that. and Mike Scott was our president. Mike Scott was into the openness of the day. The Apple II was such an open project. Anybody, we're going to give you all the information details. Plug in your own cards you can make, plug in your own software, no restrictions, and we passed out all the information to let people learn how computers are done, how boards are made, how software is written for it, models after models. We passed out huge packs of my own programs called the WAS pack to anyone who called and wanted to be a developer. So fortunately, marketing hadn't gotten control of that, and hundreds of companies started up, young people, some in high school that could build a board that could connect to a keyboard and play music, and things like that. There were all these projects coming out. So these thousands of companies selling software from games to databases to spreadsheets started up, and they were all advertising for our product, the Apple II. This Apple II computer was going to be the only source of revenue and profits for the company for the first 10 years of its existence. It's kind of nice to start a company with a product like that. My HP engineers said, this is the best product I've ever seen. So, so we had this, this really great, lucky opportunity to start that way. Probably the biggest part of the work on the Apple II was not designing the computer. People say, how long did it take you to design it? And I was just so good at designing computers. Once I had the ideas crystallized in my head, it didn't take maybe a couple of days total to have the whole thing on paper. But it takes a while just thinking out. And when you're shy, you do that a lot. You go into yourself and you think things out at night. You think it out when you're alone. So now we had this real professional company really making waves. We're starting to make money. The Apple II is selling more and more. My role in the company was I decided I would be quiet. I wanted to stay out of the press. I didn't want to be the face of the company, the symbol of the company. I was just an engineer. Engineers, I was going to do the greatest engineering. I was going to keep designing the boards that plug in to control printers and modems and serial printers and eventually floppy disk and all that stuff. Steve had this great spirit, and he was going to run things, but he didn't have any experience. He wasn't like an executive, so he couldn't have a title of an executive, but he could just sort of dabble with all the levels, anything in the company that needed attention, whether it was getting parts or deciding what the next product should be. He would be involved in that because he saw himself. He wanted to be at the head of a company. And so we were very different at that point in time, where we hadn't been in our prior youth. Steve was a non-techie. This hurt Apple a lot in those early years, but it was really fortunate because when he came back to Apple later, being a normal person, he didn't like all the techies who understood files and storage structures and megahertz and all the different aspects, timing signals on chips and interrupts. Didn't understand any of that. He just wanted the final product to work and do things for normal people like himself. That's one of the reasons we have the great products we have to this day. But in those years in Apple, when he was there before he left, he had no patience to sit down and think out a product to its fully. He wanted to have success with the money that Apple was generating, the millions of dollars. He wanted to develop new products quickly. When VisiCalc came out, the first killer app, we saw that the market for business was a lot bigger than the market for the home, and we designed the Apple III to be a business machine. It had some hardware problems right away. It got a bad reputation. Even when you fix a machine that has a bad reputation, you don't really you got to change its name and its look. The market has ruled it out. But the Apple III was coming out, and you know how every time you have a new product, it's an upgrade from the old? You'd like to be compatible. You'd like to be able to run the stuff, do the stuff you did on the old machine, plus have the newer version. So will it run the old software or not? And the Apple III was designed in a way that it couldn't really run the same disks, and it was not an extension. So to somehow sell this machine to all the lovers in the world of the Apple II, we built in a weird mode. A switch. When you booted it up as an Apple II or an Apple III. And for marketing had its engineers put chips in, so if it was booted up as an Apple II, it was a weak Apple II. It wouldn't do what the businessmen wanted. It wouldn't have enough characters on the screen for enough months on a spreadsheet. It wouldn't have enough memory for a big spreadsheet. You had to boot it up to an Apple III, and the trouble is the Apple III didn't have much software yet, and so that machine was a total failure. A guy named Jeff Raskin joined us and taught us how you've got to make machines that are intuitive and understandable so that someone who doesn't know anything at all about computers, a young child, a spouse, they can go in and figure out how to use it without a whole ton of hand-holding and manuals and having to learn what computers are. And that guy was Jeff Raskin. He took us to Xerox PARC Center eventually. He headed our publications department because his idea was, if the engineers can't explain it to publications well enough to explain it to other people, the engineers have to redo it. Well, he took us to Xerox PARC Center, where we saw the GUI machine with the mouse and the windows on the screen. Wow, that was so impressive. And right away, Steve Jobs was always fast. He was always quick. He saw that Apple had taken expensive computers and made them affordable. We could take this machine that Xerox had at a high price and make it affordable. And the trouble is, he didn't really take everything into account that an engineer would, such as how much memory does it take to make that kind of machine, and how much did memory, RAM, sell for in those days. The Lisa came out at $10,000 because of the RAM cost. That's 20,000 of today's dollars. That's too much for a personal computer. It didn't fit Apple's, what Apple had gotten used to with the Apple II. I had one of my failures on that project too. I came up with this idea that we could build our own disk drive. The outer tracks are longer than the inner tracks on a spinning disk. We could slow it down on the outer tracks and store more data. And we built our own disk called the Twiggy, and it was just a horrible failure. We couldn't make it reliably. And Sony came out with their little plastic one eventually, so that was bye-bye. The next project, based on Xerox PARC Center, Steve Jobs went and he initiated the Lisa project. And the Lisa was our version of the machine. That was the $20,000 machine. It failed, but it was a good computer. By the standards of computer science and computer engineering, it was well designed the right way, and yes, it took a megabyte of RAM that cost a fortune in those days. Well, Steve got kicked out of the Lisa group because he was frustrating the engineers and calling them idiots because he thought that they could easily design it cheaper. And he went over to a group I worked in called the Macintosh group with Jeff Raskin heading us up. And he had some strange ideas about the computer he would build, but everything on the screen would be bitmapped. And we had bitmapping on the Apple II, but too weak a processor to make things flow, text flow fast up and down the screen. So we're working on the Macintosh, and I had a plane crash. And 5 weeks later, I came out of amnesia. I called up Steve Jobs, and I said, got the most creative people in Apple, the ones who couldn't get a job or haven't gone to college, and they're working on the Macintosh, and they're going to be so good and successful. This is my last chance to go back to college and earn my degree. 1 year left to go on it. So I went back to Berkeley under a fake name because my name was known, and my Berkeley diploma says Rocky Raccoon Clark. and I came back to Apple after that, and a couple of rock concerts that were a lot of fun. I came back to Apple, and I walked into the Apple II division and said I'd like a job as an engineer. Oh yeah, I was instantly hired, and I got to attend staff meetings and learned a lot about what was going on in the company. And Steve Jobs was being very unkind to the Apple II division, put it far out of Cupertino, away from the other buildings, and called us bozos, and didn't realize that all the revenues of the companies were coming from this product. Wouldn't let us buy the good quality floppy disk from Sony, because the Macintosh was going to have a one-sided disk. We were not allowed to have a two-sided disk. It was like very competitive and very, a lot of wrongful things. Meanwhile, the Macintosh was the future of the world in all our minds. It was the future of Apple, and we were going to be the leaders and bring it to the world. And the most exciting day for me ever in the history of Apple was the day the Macintosh was introduced, and Steve Jobs told the story of how we were challenging the way things are, and it was the image of Apple that was going to persist forever. And Macintosh sold right away, and then its sales dropped, and they dropped to 500 a month. We had a version of the Apple II that would only sell 2,000 a month, and Steve Jobs had said, no, can't build it, it's not enough sales. So the Macintosh was a huge failure. Steve was kind of very much depressed by that. He wanted to change pricing so that the Macintosh could be low price, and the Apple II we wouldn't have sales from our highly profitable Apple II, and we'd give up our profits. And the boards had to make a decision. And they had to make a decision to go with John Scully. You keep the Apple II sales going for a few more years, and you build the Macintosh market with a lot of work. You work with developers, you get certain kinds of software written, you go on every sales trip possible, anything that might be 500 units into a company, you send your salespeople out there and recover that market. Well, Steve Jobs left because he was depressed, and he'd sort of had failure in the company, actually. And he spoke well, he was the face of the company, but he was an important part of the Apple II. Give him credit for that. That was a very important computer. And he went off and he started Next, and that was a failure too, but look at the great success he had with Pixar. He had the abilities to run a company. He had the ability to run Next, it was just too late in time. It wasn't the same thing as Apple. So when Jobs returned to Apple, He, A, thought a lot more professionally about all the departments in the company working together in harmony, not building too much of a product, not having excess, watching your inventory, and he had the patience. He had learned from showing the Macintosh, the Lisa computer, to Bill Gates early on, and then Microsoft had an easy time getting into that style of computer, and they probably never would have if they hadn't seen it for years. But now he had the patience to wait till products are good before you release them and spring them on the world. And the first big success was the iPod. There's more than the iPod. The iPod went with the music program, the best music program in the world, iTunes, and a new way of selling songs. And then the iPod, you know, a lot of people say, wow, it was just the perfect fit, the number of songs and the size of a package that fit in your pocket, the cost, the way it operated. It was just a beautiful device. Nobody notices that the iPod was the first time ever you didn't have any of the computer geek stuff in it. There were no files. You plugged it in your computer, your songs went to it, and it played them, and you didn't have to ever think about directory structures and folders and files and any of that stuff. It was everybody's music machine. We wrote iTunes for Windows, so the whole world could buy the iPod, and it became a huge seller, as much in terms of dollars as our Apple II had been. This was our second Apple II. That was Steve Jobs' Apple II in the company, really, the iPod. Very successful. There are debates about where the iPod really came from, but I'll leave that up to history. The iPhone was also developed. We worked on phones for 6 years. Every time we had lousy models that just weren't going to take over the world by storm, that weren't something new enough and awe enough. It would never see the light of day. Lousy products would never see the light of day under Steve Jobs. I mean, that current movie about him would never see the light of day if he was in charge of it. It's so lousy. So the iPhone, the day of the introduction of the iPhone, that was just an amazing time in history. A new technology that scientists had come up with, the multi-touch screen, so you can move things with your hand the way you do on a normal desk, the real human elements in it, and yet a method to edit text. You could type text successfully on a tiny keyboard and edit it, and it would figure out the whole methodology of the machine. The entire machine was so complete when it came out and did what people wanted, more than making calls. The most important thing was it was not a phone that could do internet stuff like email. It was a full internet computer. Full internet, the real internet, not internet filtered by a carrier or something like that. This was just a genius. People wanted the internet in their pocket. They wanted it mobile, they wanted it with them, and nobody else was recognizing it. They thought they wanted a phone that also had a couple little abilities. So that was very fortunate, and it was much more fortunate when he decided to allow apps. Allow people to all over, the hundreds of thousands of brilliant, educated CS students in universities to write apps for this machine and have their own little companies and their own little startups, and hundreds of thousands of minds could work on it. So I think that was the most important product introduction of my life, more than the Apple II. And I'd say my favorite gadget all time was probably the iPhone 4. It just hit a level of beauty and structure in a phone in your pocket that was something you didn't expect. And of course today, the iPhone 5. And yeah, iPhone 5. These are machines that are really built for the rest of us. Do you ever see anything like a file, a directory, a number about megahertz or megabytes or any of that stuff on an iPad? No, you just use it. You know, you don't have to worry that a program might have 50 little files stored different places. You click one icon and it runs that program. And that was really the beauty, that Steve Jobs didn't like the people who understood, like myself, geeks, that understood all the files and directory and wanted that complicated world. So he really wanted the simple world, and that's what we have to thank him for. What is the future? I look at the steps of the computer industry, from the hardware software of the Apple II, to the ease of computing of the Macintosh, to the internet and what that brought us to, the worldwide communications, and eventually our purchasing things and all that. And then the social web came that treated human life in that special way, and mobile computing, and we got the cloud on the horizon. And every one of those steps got closer to the technology becoming invisible and more like you deal with other human beings in your life. The technology got more like a human being in many cases. When Apple came out with the Newton message pad a long time ago, I was in the airport, San Francisco airport, with my kids flying to Orlando for Disney World, and first day I had my Newton, I got a phone call. I hand wrote a little note to myself on the notepad: Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. I saw a button called Assist, and I clicked it. It opened up the calendar. Somehow it knew what I had just typed. I didn't even think it knew that. It opened up a calendar, put in dentist on Tuesday at 2 p.m., and grabbed Sarah out of my contact list, and it changed my life forever. I said, I want devices that I can live my human way and write things with my own hand, and the machine understands what I meant, if it's understandable. And now we've got Siri. And you can ask Siri, what are the 5 largest lakes in California? How far is it from Orlando to Timbuktu? You can get the answers, right there. And it's just like you're talking to another human being. These machines are getting friendly. They have the senses of a human. They've got an eye. They've got an ear. They've got the inner ear that knows how it's moving in the world. It's got GPS to know where it is. I don't even know that when I wake up. And it's got a sense of touch like humans. And it's gotten so much like a friend that I can talk to. And Siri talks back to me. And I'm thinking that is really where we want to go. We want these devices to be best friends, not pieces of machinery we carry around and love. We want it to be a person we love. And look how many people are so close to their machine. They're always walking around using it. And it's almost like an extended limb of the human body now where we've gotten. So I predict that we're going to take human voice recognition and eventually vision recognition are going to be big features in the world heading towards real intelligent computing. Now, I'm at a company, Fusion.io, and the engineers there figured out and told me they figured out how to make an intelligent machine as intelligent as the brain. It only takes 9 months. But someday, artificial intelligence, I think, is a big feature. If you have kids in college, artificial intelligence, robotics. I want machines that help me in my life just like I always did. If I had a little robot, all the parts are getting low cost, the motors, the assemblies, the software, hardware, the understanding of it, it's all possible to do, controlled with your mobile device maybe. I want a device that sits out and mows my lawn all night long by itself. Maybe very slowly, a bit at a time, but and goes around like a Roomba. The Roomba is really the model for this. Or another device that goes and cleans every square centimeter of my car, bit by bit, but it goes all night long, and when I wake up in the morning, at least the sides of the car are clean. And I want these kind of devices. Maybe something will eventually wash the dishes. You just walk away and it picks them up and everything. I mean, I think we're on the road to a lot of devices that, I don't know, give us more time for leisure the way we should have. So in the future, yeah, I do hope my best friend that knows my heart and soul better than anything else is a machine, and that machine will encourage me to do the right things in life as a friend would. Okay, thank you very much. Let me check the time. I think we're out of time, so we're not going to be able to do many question and answers. Let's try to get at least one question. We've got a microphone somewhere here in the middle. Hello, where's the mic? Oh, it's right here. If anyone wants to come up and ask me a question, current, past, anything. I think somebody's going to announce I'm going to be on the Expo floor later. I hope to run into a lot of you personally.
Now I don't have to ask your wife to give you my card. The question is, in the Walter Isaacson's book, you talk about the fact that in order to make good software, you need to know how to make good hardware. And I'd like you to talk about that in reference to machine and wearable tech and all the other devices that are coming out.
Hardware and software. Now, when I was working on the Apple computers, we were right down at the microprocessor level and understanding the way how to make things optimal and use very few parts in there. I applied that same reasoning to computers. That's what the quote would be about, to software. I applied the same reasoning to software. Make my software as tight and tricky and interlaced and parts of it doing 2 jobs at once. That was one of the things. Let's try another question until they kick me off the stage.
Hi. You've talked about how you were influenced by a lot of electronics around you and things that really weren't in the future that you helped create. Today, where would you be able to tell kids where they need to be and what they need to be looking at to be able to help envision the next future?
Well, I just gave a few examples of kids in college, what I would recommend they study, which is voice understanding. A lot of times Siri can get my words right, but doesn't know what I meant as a human being, and another human would know. as far as vision recognition, pick up the blue box and bring it to the hallway, operating in that kind of fashion. I would also tell them computer science, work on apps. My life, everything I do at the end of the day, I look at how many apps I used and how important they all were to me. And everything I used to do in life by other methods, wow, just bring it up on the app, make an airline reservation, find where the movies are, get a taxi, get a ride, whatever, online purchasing, it's just all right there. And really, that's where you can have a lot of effect to change life, no matter where you are in the world.
So the concept was that you had engineering and sales. Which would you choose today?
Say it again?
The difference was you did the engineering, and you had someone who did the sales. How do you marry that? How do you tell kids today?
Engineering and sales. Well, sales is a part of marketing. I put marketing more important. Marketing is always the important thing. The smart people that understand what the markets are. But when young people are starting companies, I always tell them, or even within a company that exists, the marketing people are engineers a lot of times, but they should work with the actual engineers that are currently building things, because those engineers are familiar with new parts, new components, how they can be hooked together, and can come up with clever ideas of ways to do things that the marketing person alone might not have thought of. So try to include the engineers in deciding what you're going to do. A lot of kids go to business school, they learn to be entrepreneurs and write all the forms and raise some money, and once we have our money raised for an idea, we'll go hire some engineers. No, I tell them, please include the engineers with you. Try to have working models, at least working virtual demonstrations of what you're going to build, and then it's worth a lot more. Last question.
Okay. It's not really a question. I just want to say this. The world owes you a great debt, and I want to personally say thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.